And welcome back to the series going through each year between 1959 and 2019 and giving you my top 10, sometimes 15 favorite albums of each year. We're up to 1964, and at this point we're going to be going through the years one by one. Of course, the last video I grouped 1959 to 1963, but from this point up until the 2000s, it's every separate year. So strap in, it's going to be a long ride. Again, I'll mention a couple things. These are by no means what I consider to be the best albums of each year. They're just my personal favorites, the ones that I'm likely to listen to more than others at any given time. And in the event that I do not have the album in my collection, and I think I only have one, or there's only one that I don't have for this year, I'll be putting the album art up at this corner, like so. So let's jump into it. Number 10, my number 10 favorite album of 1964. You've got The Beatles' A Hard Day's Night, the UK version. There is a big difference. The US version has the Beatles songs from the film intertwined with selections from the George Martin Orchestra, the film music. The British version, side 1 are the Beatles songs from the film, side 2 are just more Beatles songs that didn't make the film. So this is a actual complete Beatles album. It's also the first Beatles album that had no covers on it, and it's also the only Beatles album where every song was a Lennon-McCartney composition. George does sing one song on here, I'm Happy Just to Dance With You, but it was written by John and Paul. So, great movie as well, one of my favorite all-time movies. Possibly my second favorite all-time movie. Number 9, we have a jazz album, Eric Dolphy, Out to Lunch. Oh man, I love this album. I have to be in the right mindset to listen to it because it is a little chaotic and disjointed, but it is so good. And this was the first jazz album that kind of was veering into free jazz that really clicked with me. I've got such really good memories attached to this album. As soon as it starts with Hat and Beard, it's just it's like an old friend walking into the room. It's a great album. Maybe not something that if you're just starting out with jazz you want to go straight to, because like I said, it is a little chaotic at times and dissident, but if you're okay with that, it's a great reward. Number 8, more jazz, but in a completely different direction. Tony Scott's Music for Zen Meditation. In the last video I talked about Kimio Ito's album Koto Music and how I had found that because I was looking for music to use for meditation. Obviously this album stuck out to me because it's called Music for Zen Meditation, and it's beautiful. It's Tony Scott, and I don't know what the Japanese instrument's called. I would butcher it if I did know what it was called. But he's one of the few Westerners that has become a master, or at this point had become a master of the instrument. So it sounds so traditional. It sounds very traditionally Japanese, but he's a Westerner. But he was accepted into the Japanese culture because his proficiency on this instrument was so exact and so traditional. So what's great about this album is that, especially these days, it seems like a lot of meditation music is very nice, it's very pleasant, but it doesn't really have any, it doesn't grab you at all. It's very much like background music. Whereas Music for Zen Meditation is very pleasant, and it can be background music, but you can also listen to it as a work of art. It's got, as Frank Zappa would say, it has eyebrows. It's got personality. So, Tony Scott. Number 7, the one I don't have in my collection, I'll throw it up here, Doc Watson's self-titled album. Now, when I was 18, 19 years old and I was a disc jockey at a country station, I got to dig through the library and find stuff that I could enjoy, because I wasn't a real big country fan. And I found Doc Watson, and there was a song on that album called Mama Don't Allow, and I played that song as much as I could get away with it. I loved it. But I always, based on that, I always thought Doc Watson was a bluegrass musician, and he can be, but his debut album is very much more like a folk, even getting into a little bit of blues area. So when I heard this, it had me reassess everything I knew about Doc Watson. And the more I listened to his early stuff, the more I really became a fan of what he was doing. His guitar playing is beautiful. His voice, even though it's kind of rugged in spots, it's also really, he emotes a lot. It's very genuine. Just great stuff. And I think that the debut is a great place to start to understand Doc Watson's music. It's really special stuff. Number 6, the album that started it all in America, Meet the Beatles. Okay, so I don't really want to go into a lengthy discussion of the American version of albums versus the British versions of the albums. It would take a whole video in itself to talk about. But basically, the albums were released in England, then they'd ship them over to America, and Capitol Records in America would kind of pull them apart and dissect them and recreate their own albums up until a certain point. So Meet the Beatles is fashioned on the Beatles' second album in Britain called With the Beatles. Similar album covers or album art. But this album, I think, tops With the Beatles. It's the running order of the songs is tighter. It's more of a rock album, I feel, as much as you could have rock back then. Plus they add I Want to Hold Your Hand, and I think This Boy too they added on there, and they pulled I Saw Her Standing There from Please Please Me to throw on here. I think it works. And another thing about American albums is Dave Dexter, the A&R man who was in charge of the Beatles catalog in America, he made some executive decisions. He decided that, it's okay, but in America, kids like a lot of reverb on their music. So he would just pile the reverb onto the early Beatles recordings, giving it this very distinct sound that I was probably the last generation that grew up with the actual albums. So people my age and older that were Beatle fans in America, that reverb-drenched sound is what we grew up on, and it still holds a special place in our hearts. We acknowledge that the British catalog and the British versions are the official canon, but these are fun, these are great, and this is how we got to know the Beatles. So in this case, I will choose the American version over the British version. So Meet the Beatles is my number 6. My number 5, we're going back to jazz, Lee Morgan, The Sidewinder. The title track alone is, you gotta hear it. It's one of the best jazz tracks ever, I think. And whereas I do like where, like I said before, where hard bop and cool jazz meet free jazz and avant-garde, this is just more plain hard bop, cool jazz. But it's perfect. And as such, it's really good for people that aren't into jazz to get into this era of jazz, because you don't have dissonance going on. You don't have abrasive instruments. It's all very, I don't want to say tame in comparison to free jazz, but oh, the quality and the melody and everything just works on this album. Number 4, interesting backstory to this album. So, when I was a kid, my dad gave me an album called Guitars A Go Go. He just had the vinyl, but he had it in an album cover of the Grassroots. Why, I don't know. And to make it even more convoluted, when I was that young, I was trying to get my hands on as many Beatles records as I could. So I had this weird Grassroots album, so I actually crossed off some, or maybe I just wrote on it Beatles, because I was trying to fool myself, I guess, into thinking that I had one more Beatles album. But I loved the vinyl, the Guitars A Go Go, and I finally found a copy with the original album cover. So this is the Stingers. They were kind of just a studio band, really. But this is great. This is great early 60s guitar instrumentals. It's kind of go-go-ish in the 60s term, not the 80s pop band. But it's just, and a lot of it may be sentimental for me, but it's really good guitar work, and it's fun. And it's only like 25, 28 minutes long, so it's, whenever you have short albums like that, at least for me, I tend to want to hear them again because they're so short. So it gets you to play the album repeatedly, and it really kind of digs into your psyche. Yeah, it's definitely a very generic. I mean, it's Crown Records. I don't know if they've, I doubt if they've ever done anything besides just cheap knockoff stuff. But yeah, it's great. I love it. I've always loved it. Number 3, another American Beatles album, Beatles 65. This one is kind of Capitol Records' mashup of Beatles for Sale, which was the Beatles' 4th album in England. And again, I really prefer this to Beatles for Sale. They took some of the best songs from Beatles for Sale, plus they added singles, the I Feel Fine and She's a Woman. It still starts off, the strongest point of Beatles for Sale for me is the opening 3 tracks. And they left those opening 3 tracks in sequence on this album: No Reply, I'm a Loser, and Babies in Black. So yeah, again, Capitol Records actually did something right here. And again, you've got that excess reverb, it really stands out on She's a Woman, because you have those sharp staccato chords. You can just hear the reverb coming off of them. It's I love it. And I also like the album cover a lot too. I think Robert Freeman, if I'm correct, took these pictures. They were supposed to represent the 4 seasons, I guess. Autumn, spring with the springs, and I'm guessing this is summer with the shady umbrella, and I guess in the winter it just rains a lot in England. Number 2. This is my favorite Christmas album, but it's not a Christmas album. Jan Johansson. This is Jazz på svenska, which I believe translate roughly to Swedish folk jazz, maybe. It is just piano and upright bass. There is something so magical about this album, though. To me, you put it on, if you close your eyes, you can feel like you're in a cabin in the woods, and outside there's snow falling, and you know when snow's falling outside, it's that extreme quiet where you can actually hear the snow hitting the snow. That's this album. It is gorgeous. Gorgeous is an understatement. But again, not in a really feathery, floofy way. It's gorgeous with personality and introspection, and it's all instrumental. And like I said, very simple, piano and bass. But there's just something. This is a wonderful album. This winter, if you need something to listen to, last time I checked, this is on YouTube. Fire it up, and yeah, it's worth it. And my number one album for 1964 is the Holy Modal Rounders' debut self-titled album. This is not the album art. This CD version is a combination of their first and second albums. I do not have a copy of their first album on vinyl because, again, it's way too expensive. Holy Modal Rounders I talked about in the debut video series, where it's Peter Stamfel and Steve Weber, a couple guys from the Northeast, and they loved the Harry Smith Songbook, the American Anthology, or the Anthology of American Music series, all the old traditional stuff, and they learned it like everybody else learned it on the Greenwich Village circuit and the folk circuit, and but they put their own spin on it, much to the dissatisfaction of some of their contemporaries. But what that does is make it much more unique, has a much more personality than your standard Kingston Trio stuff. They're funny. Peter Stamfel's voice is, I don't know how to describe it. It can be hilarious. It's like this really high, just tense. He sounds like he's on speed all the time, which honestly he might have been at the time. They were probably both doing a lot of speed. But it's so good. His voice is not good, but it works perfectly for these songs. Steve Weber's guitar playing is not technically right. He's doing this weird claw picking thing that gives it this distinctive sound too. Peter Stamfel, the guy can pretty much play every stringed instrument there is known to man, so he brings all those out in this album, but it's just the two of them, and they create this beautiful monstrosity that has to be heard to be believed. The other thing I always like to point out is that Peter Stamfel specifically said that he wanted to put the word psychedelic into the popular cultural jargon. So the very first instance of the word psychedelic being used on a pop record or folk record or any record is in the song Hesitation Blues on here. That alone is pretty significant and amazing. So that is my top 10 list for 1964. Stay tuned, because next time we'll do 1965. And yeah, do all the YouTube things, like, subscribe, comment below, tell me what you think about the list, if you agree, if you don't agree. And yeah, we will see you next time. So until then,